Before I die, please listen. These were the words Samuel Noah Kramer was said to whisper to a colleague during the final days of his life, a man who had spent almost 8 decades trying to understand the first civilization humanity ever built and who, at the end, realized that perhaps understanding it had come at the cost of his peace. Kramer wasn't a mystic or a philosopher by profession. He was a scholar, an archaeologist of language, a man who lived for clay tablets and fragments of history. Born in 1897 in the small town of Zhytomyr, Ukraine, and raised in Philadelphia, Kramer would become the most celebrated Sumeriologist of the 20th century. But what he uncovered in the baked mud of Mesopotamia was not just history, it was a mirror held up to our world today. And what that mirror reflected terrified him. In the 1920s, Kramer began his long, patient descent into time. The Sumerians, who flourished in Mesopotamia around 400 BCE, left behind tens of thousands of clay tablets, records of trade, prayers, myths, and laws. These tablets, written in the world's first known written language, cuneiform, represented the dawn of history itself. Before them, there had been only memory and story, afterward, there was record and permanence. Most scholars saw these tablets as linguistic relics, proof that civilization had begun in commerce and law. But Kramer saw something different. He saw a pattern, a code. The tablets were not random, they were part of an operating system, an architecture of civilization itself. He noticed how the earliest words weren't about beauty or emotion. They were about ownership, measurement, boundaries, obedience. They encoded not feelings, but control. The first verb, as far as he could tell, wasn't to love or to dream, it was to give. And the second was to take. Kramer began to suspect that writing had not been born from the human desire to express, but from the human need to command. By the 1950s, Kramer's studies had taken him deep into the logic of Sumerian language, its grammar, its metaphors, its structure. What he found disturbed him. Sumerian wasn't simply a way to describe the world, it was a system for organizing it. Every concept, every symbol, every grammatical rule implied hierarchy, something that stood above, and something that stood below. The more Kramer read, the clearer it became, the Sumerians had built a society based on written command. Their temples functioned like bureaucracies, their priests like administrators, their gods like celestial governors. The Sumerian city wasn't just a collection of buildings, it was an early computer, an algorithm made of human lives. Every person had a function, every action a record, every prayer a transaction. In one of his later essays, Kramer wrote a sentence that puzzled even his peers. To write is to bind the world in lines. At the time, few paid attention. But in his private notebooks, ones that were found only after his death, he expanded on the idea. Writing, he believed, was a kind of magic spell, a technology of obedience. To name something was to fix it in place, to control it. Once a law or an order was written, it gained power beyond any individual voice. It became eternal. Kramer saw in the tablets the birth not only of civilization but of authority. Humanity had learned to speak to the gods, but in doing so, had also learned to obey them. By the time Kramer published History Begins at Sumer in 1956, he had decoded hundreds of myths and administrative texts. What fascinated him most wasn't the content, it was the structure. Whether describing the building of a ziggurat, the hierarchy of gods, or the measurements of grain, the structure was always the same, a sequence, a process, an input leading to an output. He began to describe Sumerian civilization as the world's first software, an elaborate code for running society. The temples were databases, the priests were programmers. Each ritual was a script. Each offering was a command line to the divine. It wasn't metaphorical. Kramer was serious. He wrote that the Sumerians created the template for all systems of human management. And when you looked closely, the same patterns emerged in later civilizations, Babylon, Egypt, Greece, Rome. Even in modern bureaucracies. The same code kept reappearing, rewritten in new languages, but never erased. In the myths, Kramer noticed something else, the Sumerians didn't believe the gods made humans out of love. They believed the gods made humans to relieve themselves of labor. Humanity was born to serve. To till the fields of heaven, as one tablet said. It was a chilling metaphor that Kramer began to see everywhere, in religion, in government, even in modern economics. Work, he wrote in his private notes, is the last surviving ritual of the temple. As he aged, Kramer became increasingly isolated in his views. His colleagues thought he was drifting into mysticism. But Kramer wasn't claiming divine revelation. He was warning of a recursion, that the linguistic and symbolic systems the Sumerians created had never been broken. In a recorded lecture from 1972, his voice trembles slightly as he says, "We think we are free because our gods have changed names, but our gods are still made of words." He drew a line from the Sumerian tablet to the printed law, to the digital screen. Each evolution, he said, made the code more efficient, less visible, and more powerful. When writing first appeared, only priests could read it. Today, everyone reads, but the system writes us back, through data, algorithms, and language we don't control. The Sumerians invented writing to track goods, but in doing so, they created a system that began tracking people. We became entries in an endless ledger, a civilization-wide account that continues updating itself every second. Every transaction, every click, every word, we are still inscribed in the Book of Sumer. Kramer began to suspect that civilization wasn't evolving, but repeating, that the same structure of command and submission had been rewritten into every new empire. The syntax changed, but the logic remained the same. In 1986, a year before his death, Kramer delivered his final public lecture. Those who attended remember it as a strange and haunting performance. He didn't bring notes. He didn't read translations. Instead, he spoke softly, as if confiding in the audience something deeply personal. "When I was young," he began, "I believed that learning Sumerian would help me understand the past. But now I see, it has taught me about the present." He spoke of the language of power, of how every civilization organizes thought around invisible hierarchies. He warned that the symbols we use to describe reality eventually become the reality itself. "We think with the tools we inherit," he said, and those tools were designed to build pyramids. At one point, a student asked if he believed we could ever escape this system. Kramer paused for a long time. Then he smiled faintly and said, "Only if we learn to speak without chains." He died the following year. Among his papers was a short, handwritten note titled The Last Tablet. It contained only 3 sentences. "The tablets are still speaking that we are still writing their words, the code is complete, and it calls itself civilization." Decades later, his words have taken on a strange resonance. Linguists, historians, and technologists still debate what he meant by the code. Some think it was a poetic metaphor. Others think he saw a genuine structural pattern linking ancient systems to modern ones. But the deeper question is the one Kramer left unanswered: who is writing now? When you look at the world through Kramer's eyes, the parallels become unsettling. The Sumerians used tokens to represent goods, early data points. They used tablets to record transactions, early databases. Their temples were administrative hubs, proto-servers. Their gods, distant and inscrutable, demanded obedience through symbols. Replace gods with systems, and you have the 21st century. Kramer's revelation wasn't mystical. It was cybernetic. He realized that language is not neutral, it's architecture. Every word shapes behavior. Every sentence limits possibility. Once a society agrees on how to name things, it also agrees on how to obey them. He warned that we were living inside an inherited operating system, one that began 5,000 years ago, written not in binary but in belief. Each time we say should, must, own, owe, or deserve, we activate that ancient code. We still speak the language of the first accountants of heaven. And yet, Kramer wasn't without hope. In one of his rare optimistic letters, he wrote, "If language can bind, perhaps it can also release, what was written can be rewritten. He believed that by understanding the origins of our systems, the myths that shape our reality, we might begin to unwrite them. That the true power of knowledge is not in control, but in awareness. In that sense, his plea, "Before I die, please listen," wasn't a warning of doom, but an invitation to consciousness. He wanted us to see the invisible code running beneath history, to realize that civilization itself is a kind of software we've mistaken for destiny. To listen, in Kramer's sense, means to awaken, to hear the echo of Sumer in the hum of our machines, in the laws we follow, in the gods we invent. Imagine, for a moment, that Kramer was right. That somewhere, buried under 5 millennia of language and law, the first program still runs, a sentence written in clay that has never stopped executing. That sentence might have been simple: the gods command, the humans obey. Or perhaps, write the world, and it will remain written. Every civilization since has added its own lines to the code, kings and priests, bankers and engineers, each contributing to a grand script that defines what it means to be human. And yet, if we listen carefully, beneath the digital noise, we might still hear the scratching of a stylus on wet clay. Because the tablets never stopped speaking. They simply changed their form. We live now in a world of data, not clay, of algorithms, not priests. But the pattern remains. We still measure, record, categorize, obey. The architecture of belief has become invisible, but it is no less binding. We kneel now before systems we do not understand, just as the Sumerians once did before their gods. The question Kramer left us with is not whether the code exists. The question is whether we will ever stop repeating it. There's a fragment of an old Sumerian hymn Kramer translated in his youth. It reads, "The word is seed, the word is stone, the word builds the house of the gods." Perhaps Kramer saw, even then, that humanity has always been building that house, brick by brick, word by word, line by line. And perhaps his final revelation was that we no longer need to worship what we've built. Before I die, please listen, not because the words are sacred, but because they are alive, not because the past holds the answers, but because it holds the pattern, and if we can finally see that pattern for what it is, a code, we might, for the first time in 5,000 years, learn to write something new.